Hello and welcome to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one the Russians have managed to advance in the northern section of the front line in the direction of Kupiansk, gaining full control over the town of Kindrashivka. The Russians advanced west of Dubrova along the Serebryansky forest area. The Russians also managed to advance on the northern flank of Toretsk and south of Jablonivka. At the same time, they managed to advance to the southwest of Pokrovsk and in the direction of Kumar from the south. Starting out in the northern section of the front line, the Russians managed to advance and gain full control over Kindrashivka. As we see with this geolocated footage, the Russians managed to raise the flag in the central parts of the town. With full control over Kindrashivka, the battle has begun over Radkivka to the south, Tushenkivka to the west, and continues over Malashevkivka. The Russians are here securing the main highway from Kupiansk here in the south, all the way to Devorishna in the north. The objective of the Russians is to secure a supply route to the northern outskirts of Kupiansk, cut off the supply lines for the Ukrainians in the northern parts of the town, and to start the battle over the town itself. The Russian objective is to fight over the town from the northern flank on both the eastern and western banks of the Oskil River line. This is to cut off the entire grouping of Ukrainian forces across the Oskil River line on the eastern bank of it. To encircle these forces would be a major hit to the Ukrainian defensive line in the area and the defensive capabilities going forward. And that is exactly why the Ukrainians have organized a strong defense on the northern flank of Kupiansk, launched several counterattacks to secure the flank. However, the Russians continue their advances nonetheless, however slowly. If the Ukrainians are unable to completely stop the advance and reverse it, the Ukrainians will be forced to withdraw from the eastern bank of the Oskil River line and give up their foothold from across. With this, the Russians will be able to concentrate their forces across the Oskil River line in their crossing near Devorishna, gain control over Kupiansk for an additional major supply hub for their forces, and establish additional forces here in the southern parts of the Oskil River line for the battle over Lyman. Speaking of Lyman, the Russians, after their failed attempt to gain control over Toretsk, started advancing in the eastern flank of the town. The Russians are here advancing through the Serebryansky forest area. Their objective is to secure the area west of Dubrova. To reach the southern outskirts of Toretsk, a combined attack from the northern, eastern, and southern flanks of Toretsk will allow the Russians to have a much larger possibility of success. The Russians failed with the current attempt to take control over Toretsk because the Ukrainians, through a counterattack using tunnels, managed to re-enter the fish farm and cut off the northern supply route for the Russian forces. This left the Russians operationally encircled for 2 weeks. If the Russians had additional supply routes in and out of the town, they'll be able to withstand any counterattack on one flank and will force the Ukrainians to establish counterattacks on multiple flanks. Will also secure the eastern flank completely with the northern and southern flanks under their control, and that is why the Russians are now working on fighting through the Serebryansky forest area, where the Ukrainians have a lot of trenches and fortified positions, slowing down Russian advances. On the northern flank of Toretsk, the Russians have managed to make several advances, gaining control over fortified positions here to the east of Delivka, advancing along the main road from Ozaryanivka upwards towards Delivka. Russians managed to gain control over the fortified positions along the road here to the west of Ozaryanivka and are fighting over the road leading up to Delivka from the east. The Russians have managed to cut off any Ukrainian forces in the forest lines here to the southeast of Delivka, forcing them back to the fortified positions to the eastern flank of the town. The Russians are here looking to connect their forces within Delivka with the ones advancing from the east to cut off the final fortified positions to the southeast of Delivka and fight over the fortified positions to the north of the town to begin fighting over the remaining parts of it, securing it for further offensive operations in the northern, western, and eastern directions. The Russians are here fighting over Delivka, which will open the road for Bilahora. Gaining control over that will allow the Russians to flank the fortified positions of the Ukrainians east of Bilahora. Their objective is to connect with their forces in the southern flank of Chesev Yar. A combined assault from the Russian forces in the northern and southern flanks of Belgorod, cutting off the fortified positions of the Ukrainians along the canal and connecting the forces within Chasiv and Toretsk, will allow the Russians to create a much stronger push on the southern flank of Kupyansk for direct assaults towards the city after they start operationally encircling it. It will also allow the Russians to have a much stronger and larger concentration of forces across the canal, connecting their forces in the northern flank through Chasiv and the southern flank with the supply hub of Vuhledar supplying the forces. The Russians will be able to field a massive amount of forces in this section of the front line. Russians also managed to advance to the southwest of Delivka and within the second Delivka, where the Russian objective is to encircle the Ukrainian forces in the fortified positions east of the southern Delivka. The objective of the Russians for this is to secure the western flank of Delivka, additional advances through the railways towards the fortified positions east of Lyshivka and Ivanopilya, and also to flank Belgorod from the rear. With this, we see that the Russians are currently launching 3 separate attacks through the western flank of Encirclement, the north of Druzhba, and along the railway itself. In addition to this, the Russians are also advancing west of Toretsk and Krymsk, where they've managed to gain control over much of the remaining first patch here northwest of Krymsk, their fortified positions in the area, leaving the Ukrainians with a small foothold within it. This will force the Ukrainians back towards the fortified positions here northwest of Delivka. At the same time, with the additional push along the reservoir, the Russians are here working on securing the eastern flank of the industrial zone west of Toretsk in their objective to gain control over that as a logistical hub and also as a forward outpost to flank the fortified positions of the Ukrainians. At the same time, with the control over Zoria and Romanivka to the southwest, the Russians would be looking to operationally encircle the Ukrainian forces. To achieve that, they would need to push in the direction of Katerinivka and Kupiansk, taking control over the towns and fortified positions on the high ground west of Donetsk and Jablonivka, and gain control over the industrial zone on the eastern flank will allow the Russians to operationally encircle the Ukrainians with a choke point here in the railway direction, where there will be almost no residential areas for the Ukrainians to move through. Instead, they'll be exposed in this choke point here east of Kupiansk, which will significantly hurt the Ukrainian supply situation within Novospassky, Shcherbinivka, and fortified positions and the northern outskirts of Toretsk. All of this will be a major defeat for the Ukrainians, as a large portion of their forward positions will be encircled, operationally encircled, and any supplies, reinforcements, or withdrawal from this entire area will be under direct fire control of Russian forces, as they'll be working on securing both flanks of this choke point. Further to the west, the Russians are continuing their attacks towards Jablonivka, gaining control over the road to the south of the town. Following the encirclement of the fortified positions, they managed to gain control over those here to the southwest of Jablonivka. The Russians at the same time advanced both in the northern and southern bank of the river line through Jablonivka. The Russians are working on gaining control over the fortified positions and residential areas in the northern bank of the river line, while pushing through the southern bank of the river line, where they are not just attacking directly from the west, but supplying their forces and creating additional supply roads through the southern flank, where fighting is taking place over the forest lines, fortified positions, and roads leading up to Jablonivka. The Russian objective here is to create as many supply routes as possible up to Jablonivka to gain full control over the town and the fortified positions, to push into the direction of Encirclement. Gaining control over the western parts of the reservoir will allow the Russians to have a control over the southern flank of Kashantinivka for future offensive operations towards the 4 towns here on the western flank for the operational encirclement of the city. At the same time, will also allow the Russians to gain control over the highway leading up to Encirclement for additional pushes in the direction of Katerinivka and Kupiansk. To the southwest of Pokrovsk, the Russians managed to advance within Encirclement, gaining control over the majority of the town, leaving just the western parts remaining under Ukrainian control. The roads to the north of Encirclement and to the west of Encirclement have both been cut off, leaving just a singular road to the fortified positions connecting the western parts of the town. following which there is no road leading elsewhere. The Ukrainians would have to go through the open fields, although we are now in the summer period, which means that the Ukrainians will have the ability to drive vehicles through the fields. Instead, what we see is that the Ukrainian positions are fairly isolated here in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. The Russians can push through Novosibirsk, gain control of the remaining parts of the town and the fortified position to cross over the border area and flank Novomykolaiivka from the north and push onwards towards the border area, gaining full control over the border area here from Novosibirsk in the north to Fedorivka in the south, which will allow the Russians to launch offensive operations towards Novopavlivka, both from the roads here to the northeast and through the fields to the east. And with their recent advances on the northern flank of the defensive line of the Ukrainians, they may also look to gain control over those and advance through the highway itself towards Novopavlivka. They'll have plenty of room to supply their forces through the highway itself, leading from Korokhove, which leads from Donetsk all the way to the front line. The Russians also managed to advance in the direction of Kumar, gaining control over the majority of Fedorivka, as we see with this geolocated footage. The Russians also managed to advance along the road east of Kumar and the forest lines in that direction. The Russians are looking to gain control over the southern flank of Kumar, flank the fortified positions to the west, while at the same time attacking Kumar from the southeast and directly from the east through the highway connecting to Oderatne. The Russian objective here is to gain control over Kumar, which will allow them to establish that as a supply hub for further offensive operations towards the border area and to take control over all of the settlements here in the border area. It will also allow the Russians to establish offensive operations towards the flank of the fortified positions, cutting off the supply road here in the northwest, will allow the Russians to significantly limit the supplies going to these forward positions in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. In conclusion, the Russians continue their offensive operations from all across the front line, but have managed to advance in several sectors of it as they continue their operations to cut off the supplies, operationally encircle the Ukrainian forces, and siege their fortified positions and heavily defended towns, inflicting as many casualties as possible on the Ukrainian forces, while at the same time playing it safe for their own forces by not launching any major offensives with a lot of units, which puts them at a lot of risk. Instead, as is stated by Deep State Map, the majority of the Russian attacks are typically groups of up to 7 soldiers, so about half a squad, that launch operations together. They push through the first lines with the cover of artillery, FPV drones, and so on. So while official media keep talking about midwave tactics, is it really a midwave tactic if 7 soldiers have artillery support, FPV drone support, FAB bomb support, and everything you need to support your forces and keep them safe? In reality, this is a discussion that has long since concluded, with midwave tactics being debunked time after time again, but they also keep going back to it just to diminish any advances the Russians make by suggesting that the Russians are taking heavy losses. Well, you see the reality for yourself. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.